welcome to the 40k Fireside podcast, where we discuss everything to do with competitive Warhammer 40k with your hosts Vic VJ and David Gaylord.
Hello and welcome everyone. My apologies, I'm just finishing off eating something, because this is going to be a long one. I probably won't be able to do this in one recording actually. Stay hydrated. Okay, today I'm going to be walking you through WTC terrain. At the Fireside RTT we held recently, I had a gentleman come up to me and say, "Hey David, a great idea for a video would be to discuss the WTC terrain, what are the pros and cons of it, how I would deploy, what some of the key angles are, because I have my Team National application process going on, and I'm finding it a little bit of a steep learning curve to get onto. So if you had some material that could bootstrap me to get into WTC terrain, that would be great." So I said that's a fantastic idea, and asked some questions on our members Discord, which if you're not a member of, you can join at the Phoenix Lord level. I asked on our Discord if people had questions they could field, and I would answer them in the video as well. Just remember, like, comment and subscribe. It really helps our channel. And check out 40kfireside.com if you want to learn from the best players at super affordable prices. We are very close to 10k subs, so I'm really hoping we can hit that maybe by the end of the year. That'd be awesome as well. Okay, so WTC terrain. I know if you're in the UK and you don't play on Games Workshop terrain, you don't really have a great feeling for what the meta is like that, based on that terrain format. And likewise, I feel like it's probably a similar experience if you're based in the USA, or if you're based in Europe. You probably have a misunderstanding of the nuances in lists that are taken to make sure that they function on those terrain formats. For example, in UKTC, every single person's list is, well, in the UK, playing on UKTC, I would say everyone's list is hyper-tuned for that specific terrain format. There are units that people will take, myself included, that will operate on specific boards later into the tournament round and have movement characteristics that can go from one ruin to the next very reliably. So, you always have to take it with a grain of salt when you see someone's list, of course, and that's because the terrain format has such a large impact on it. So I thought today we're going to go through the WTC terrain, answer some of the big questions, go through all the layouts, tell you how to deploy a shooting army, a combat army on them, and it'll be a great time. So get strapped in. If you're painting some models, sit back, relax, and enjoy. Okay, what we're going to be covering today, breaking down each terrain piece for WTC. So there's only a couple of them, so don't get too stressed out. How does WTC compare to UKTC and Games Workshop? What are some of the key differences here? Got a section on the member Discord questions. What layouts don't really work? So for different deployments, what don't really function for WTC? And then we're going to go into the Crucible of Battle, Search and Destroy, Hammer and Anvil, and Tipping Point boards. And we're going to go through each single deployment on each single map layout. Don't worry though, some of them are very similar, so it'll be pretty quick to get through all them. And I'm going to demonstrate how to deploy what are some of the key angles for shooting and melee armies. My hope is by the end of this, you will have a great idea around, like, if you wanted to go play a WTC game or a game on WTC, maybe on Discord, on TTS, you'll have a good idea that you can be like, okay, I can play this army and I can deploy here. Maybe I'll swap out this unit because maybe two of them don't function on WTC terrain, for example. Okay, a nice little photo. This is myself and Team New Zealand playing at the WTC 2024. I think we came 9th that year. I won top placing individual for the entire tournament, and it was a hell of a year for us as well. So the WTC is obviously stands for World Team Championships, where great memories and friendships are forged and the highest level of competition. But people play on WTC terrain format all over the world as well. In New Zealand, we primarily play on WTC terrain, for example. Okay. So let's go straight into the terrain pieces. Now, this may look a little bit esoteric, but I'm going to translate that to TTS here in a minute. There are more or less two pieces of terrain styles and then one container, right? This bottom part here, the prototype beta ruin, is basically a flat piece, a rectangle that only applies to some maps, and we're not going to be discussing those maps, so don't worry about it. So we have the containers. These are, the dimensions that you can see over here. They're armored containers. You cannot draw line of sights between the gaps on them. They are considered to be rectangles that are high to prevent some movement and prevent line of sight. I believe every single board has containers on it, and they're usually quite well positioned to either impact strategic reserves or impact the movement through the middle of the board potentially. Then we have the small ruin, or I guess they call it the 2-story ruin. Now, first thing we're going to talk about is the dimensions of the terrain plate, right? These dimensions pertain to the terrain plate, and you'll see it's a 9x5. So 5 inches up like this, and then 9 inches across. Now, both of the terrain plates are both 9x5s. Where this becomes important is if you have a model which can move through walls, then you'll need to be able to move through a minimum of 5 inches of movement, more or less, right? This can come up if you're planning on, breaking through with a Crusher Stampede model or a Knight, for example. You'll need to clear about 4.5 inches from the front of your base to the back of your base to get over and move through that ruin there. Coincidentally, if you want to stand on the terrain plate and you want to shoot out of it, then you will need to be within the 9x5 terrain plate here. Now, as you can see, this also has some ruin floors, and the top floor width, as denoted, is 51 mils. Now, the top floor ruins are not as impactful on this ruin per se, but they are more impactful on the Super L. I guess some people call them the Super Ls, but that's usually denoting when two of these are joined together. So we'll just call this the big L. The floor widths are 33 millimeters, so you can hide a Space Marine model up to a 32 mil Space Marine model. Notably, Desolation Marines were quite popular here on 2023 WTC at the beginning of the edition, particularly because on the second floor you are 6 inches up, right? It'll say somewhere here you go, floors are 3 inches and 6 inches high respectively. So you can get plunging fire if you are 6 inches up, for example. Notably, if you're 6 inches up, you cannot really be charged by an infantry model unless they jump on the floor as well. So some small things like that are important. One other thing I forgot to mention here is that the side wall here, as you can see here, is considered to be less than 4 inches, but I believe it is exactly 4 inches. Top width is 33, height 5, so I believe it is shorter than 4 inches for the purpose of allowing models. I believe it is roughly 4 inches high anyway. Maybe it's 3 inches high, but where that can then become important, and I can demonstrate this on TTS in a minute, is if you want to hide a model that is going to be lower than that wall line, that can be quite important in some of your list design features. And a Rhino, for example, with nothing on the top of it, does hide within that ruin and cannot be seen by an opposing model at the same height, for example. So let's jump into TTS, and I'll just run through some of this here. Okay, if I get asked this every single time, but if you want to use the map I'm using, it's called Hutber 40k Competitive. And because I just found this out as well, if you want to increase your TTS performance, you can put on the Vulkan processor, which is in the beta options for Steam. It's what I've just switched to, and it's been working well. Okay, so this has the WTC maps here, and let's load up maybe a classic map. That's not a classic one. This is a classic one. Okay, so as you can see here, I will get out. Have I got a Rhino in here? I believe I do have a Rhino. Now, I'm not going to say that or claim that these are completely accurate, but in terms of height-wise, but you can kind of see what I'm talking about. And obviously the Vulkan processor is kind of struggling with these textures, just as I talked about that. But you can see, for example, a Rhino does hide nicely under this ruined floor. So for example, if you're going to shoot it through this way, you couldn't actually shoot it there. So something to consider there. That can maybe be quite impactful, especially if you want to scoot under a ruin like this and have your opponent's objective right here. You may find that important to do. Likewise, here are the large ruins, and you can see this is 6 inches tall right here. One thing that's notable as well is that these ruins floors are not super tall, so you are actually able to move straight over them sometimes. If you have a vehicle characteristic that can move, 12 inches, maybe 15 inches, there is a possibility of just moving straight over top of it as well. Through this gap right here, it is considered to be 4 inches or less, for example. So those are the 3 pieces. And when you go to set up a terrain board, I think the first time I did it, it was really cumbersome. I would recommend, if you are playing in real life, try and get a map that has the inches and incremental markers along the side. That'll really help. But one thing I would recommend, if you do have a terrain set, just set up all the base plates first in position, right? And then snap the big pieces onto it afterwards. That'll make it a lot easier. And as you can see, the board is primarily comprised of these 9x5 squares with just 2 different ruin types on them, for example. Sometimes the heavy boards are actually the same as a normal board, but simply have more of these ruins on them, more of the big L's on them. Whereas the light tables traditionally will have the objective more or less in the open. And then finally you can see the containers here. Now, I'm not completely up to date with the ruling on whether or not you can put something on top of it, but I will find that out in a second here as I text my teammates. Okay, got that one on the back burner now. So, that's the general terrain format. Now I'll go over some of the next content. Okay, what are the primary differences here? And once again, this is just based on my experience. If I had to choose one terrain format to play and get high quality games on for the rest of my career, I guess I could say at this point, I would probably pick the WTC terrain format. It creates for more interesting games, I think, on average. But it is interesting to play on different terrain formats. And as my teammate Liam says, terrain is terrain, it doesn't really matter if one is better than the other, it's just different, right? Some lists are better on some lists are better on others. So in my opinion, on Games Workshop terrain, there is or does exist deployment zone to deployment zone shooting, right? I think that's the only terrain format where that really does exist. 1 inch is, and when I say 1 inching off a wall is definitely a factor on GW terrain. And by that I mean being an inch off, just over an inch off, so your opponent cannot charge you with a base size greater than 1 inch. There aren't really any very tall ruins on Games Workshop terrain. There are some exceptions to this, and you would have to check with the local environment you play in, because people obviously have the base plates for Games Workshop terrain and then play whatever ruins at the store they have on them. So BFS terrain is probably the best example of this, where they are very tall and thick ruins, whereas, and not very aesthetic, I guess you could say. They're not very thematic of ruins. Whereas, a range of shops I've been and played at have old ruins from 8th edition, for example, that they would then use to create Games Workshop terrain. So you can get a bit of variance, I would say, in the actual ruin type, which is on Games Workshop, which is kind of unique to Games Workshop terrain. You get very thick terrain plates in Games Workshop terrain, and that's kind of similar to WTC terrain. And I would say you get good strategic reserve shooting from Games Workshop terrain in general. Now, in comparison, on UKTC, the deployment zone is quite heavy, I would say. 1 inching is a very big factor on UKTC, is a pretty problematic part of the game, I think, in that sense. There is an ultra-large 9x9 ruin, which is very impactful in both the macro strategy of the game and list design. There are not many terrain plates to go onto and shoot from. And then finally, there is good strategic reserve shooting. So, to summarize, the main point I would say from this is that both Games Workshop and UKTC have a very right angle style to them. Once you see past a point, it unlocks a large part of the board. And why don't I just jump in? Let's reload this. And I'll kind of demonstrate this. as I forget not to swap over. So let's just load up a UKTC map. These have obviously changed very, very recently, but why don't we load up maybe this map here. And see what I mean by this. So on UKTC terrain, if you can go past this point here, you'll be able to see into their deployment zone, up into here, up into here, up into here. And a lot of people will go, you have to get past this point to shoot me, for example, right? Likewise, if you go across this piece, suddenly it unlocks an enormous part of the board. Likewise, if you go past, well, roughly kind of this point here, it will unlock an enormous part of the board. And that's what I kind of mean by very right angles, for example. Like, for example, if you get past this point here, it unlocks a big part of the board, right? On WTC, for example, it's much more gradient orientated. What do I mean by that? I mean that the ruins are typically not placed at right angles to the board, which prevents this, well, not prevents as if it's a bad thing, but it means that the more that you move, if you move Y, then you kind of get X line of sight. For example, let's pick up, this board always feels like this. And I'll put the deployment zones on. This board kind of feels like this. There is a angle here that exists, which people stay behind. But also there's kind of an angle that people stay behind that looks something like, you know, this, for example, right? Well, there is always this angle which people stay behind. And that is definitely a version of unlocking it. But you can imagine if you're moving down this direction, here, the further you go here in a movement, the more it'll unlock of this line of sight, right? If you move to here, then you can cut this angle even finer. So that's an example of, you can move past this point right here, but the further you move, the more you unlock at an angular rate. And that's because many of these ruins are placed at angles to the board edge, right? You can see here. Whereas typically on other terrain formats, they are placed at right angles, right? Like this, for example. Or like where this ruin is placed, which can create the element of once you move past a point, you can typically see a large part of it. So that is just something that happens on the boards. But it can have an impact as well. So one other thing that, let's go back to the presentation really quickly. I've said objectives are always on or within ruins for thinking about WTC terrain. That's generally speaking very true, unless you're playing on the light table. Now, what I would say is the WTC is used as a terrain format, a team's terrain format pack, but that does not necessarily mean that you have to always use that. And if you're playing a singles tournament, for example, you will typically not play on the light tables, right? You will play on the medium tables or the heavy ones, because heavies typically only have a large ruin in place. They don't have a difference in where the terrain plates are placed, right? Whereas the light tables have a difference in where the terrain plates are placed. Deployment zones are 75% covered from turn 1 shooting, I would say. Yes, and large ruins, you can hide tall models behind. Yeah, as you can imagine, you can get a knight here. Okay, do I have a Chaos Knight list here? So I'll swap back to TTS. You can imagine on these boards, you can actually hide a knight here, like that. And typically, this is actually very hard to see, right? These terrain plates are very tall. I believe this is 9 inches, maybe taller than 9 inches. And the knight is like fully hidden, for example. So that's nice if you play on a board with lots of these terrain plates here, like maybe one in the middle, one here, and one here, and one here. Then that might be really advantageous for you if you're a knight player. So that would be a difference between a heavy board and a normal board here, is where you've got 4 of these in the middle. And in fact, just to demonstrate that right now, I'll load up a map. This is a good example. Nope. Well, one thing, if you're looking at it, you can see the heavy tables have got 6 of these blue parts on them. And this is the map we were just talking about. This one is slightly different. Sometimes in the maps, the ruin is closed to you, like this way from this shooting. Sometimes it's open-faced, right? So that's a little thing to consider. But as you can see, this one has 6 of the large L's in here. So the light table will have 1 per player, the medium table will have 2 per player, and the heavy will have 3 per player. Okay, going back. So that's kind of my difference, on a whole. Obviously, WTC, the largest difference in playing on it is that it uses the 2-inch engagement rule when you charge. I'm not going to go through the very extensive fight phase player pack for how to play this, but effectively what it means is that when you charge, and you would need to be inside a wall to successfully make that charge, you may position your model as such, to theoretically be inside your model. Now, I think technically the way this works is that when you charge, you get and you end within 2 inches, you get a 2-inch engagement token, which you can then use to engage across 2 inches. I would recommend going in on that. It's probably an entire... Okay, I don't want to make it sound like it's a huge topic, but there are nuances in it which may impact your game. Most people just play it. You could just be in the wall and hit someone on through the wall, but you place your model outside the wall, obviously. Now, that has a very big impact on how the game is played, particularly for, obviously, melee armies, but even shooting armies when you play against melee armies. Okay. So now we had some members questions. I'm going to jump to these really quick. Okay. How would you adjust a typical list used on GW to I wrote that incorrectly. How would you adjust a list typically used on UKTC or Games Workshop to WTC terrain? Can I just take my normal list? Okay, great question. Now let's think about this back on TTS here. So, let's say I've got, for example, trying to think of a list. Let's say I've got my ETC list, Black Templars I played at ETC. Now, this was a list which clearly I played on WTC terrain at ETC. However, there are some things which I would change if I was playing it for a singles event. One thing that can be difficult is these repulsor executioners or large models are more susceptible to being move blocked on WTC terrain, I would say. A couple of reasons why. They are difficult to deploy right in this position, right? Like that's just not working. So it's actually difficult for them to get to this position and shoot onto this board right here. So this means that for large models, there are typically limited movement patterns throughout the boards, right? You've got this one, you've got straight through the middle here. You've got this one straight down here. And you've got this one here into here or here staged into then shooting here into their ruin and here over there. So on games on WTC, you are a little bit more limited in your ability to play larger models, particularly if you're susceptible to being move blocked. So that's definitely something I would consider. Now in a team environment, you can kind of structure yourself to pick whatever board you want, which can, increase your ability to play different maps, for example. You can imagine actually a Repulse Executioner kind of plays well on the small plates here, right? It has the ability to step in and be on top of step on the terrain plate and shoot out of it, which is kind of nice. So that's one aspect I would say in terms of big models. The next one being, you're going to want, if you're playing zero shooting, if you're playing zero combat, you're going to want at least a good amount of move blocking. And if you're playing combined arms, you're going to want to have a good amount of chaff. For example, castling on WTC is very important and your ability to castle, because your opponent can engage you across 1 inch, right? Now, if you're playing a combat army and you're playing against other combat armies, you would oftentimes be an inch off the wall, wherever this was, right? And, be right here. I'm going to put a 1 inch bubble up. Wherever this is, and you would have your most expensive melee unit 1 inch off the wall here. The only way they'd be able to charge you is maybe through here or, down this way, right? Now, imagine if you had your very expensive and good melee unit right against, like this on WTC, your opponent would simply be able to charge you, right? For example, let's say I'm playing both units here, and I've got my Sword Brethren here. I want to charge these Assault Intercessors. Well, now I can, because all I need to do is roll a charge here, and my guys are technically fighting, even though they would have been inside the wall like this, for example. Right, so what this means is that you're going to need another unit of chaff to protect your melee units, right? You can't simply protect your melee units by being 1 inch off the wall. So that not only affects shooting armies that want to stage their vehicles, but it affects combat armies protecting against other combat armies, right? you're going to want to actually allow your opponent to engage you by being against the wall and have your expensive melee unit tucked in just behind it. This is a concept called castling, and castling in combat mirrors is probably the #1 mistake I see players make. And if you want to learn more about it, you can take the Combat Masterclass by Liam VSL. It's where I learned to do this very well myself as well. I've been playing combat only for quite a long time now this year. And so in this example, you actually want to let your opponent charge you, right? Because you don't want them to be able to 1-inch engaged or 2-inch engagement into your good melee unit here, right? So units like Gretchen, units like Cultists, like Zangors, like Intercessors, for example, are really useful to prevent your opponent from actually hitting into your good melee unit. So you can kind of replace the 1-inch rule by just a unit of chaff. Then you get this really interesting play of, well, your opponent could come around here, bomb this unit to hit it really, like to shoot it, overextend to do that. And then they could come in for your big melee unit. Then you might have another heroic here ready, or they might have a vector aura, so they prevent your heroic and then prevent your fight on death. Lots of different things that can happen in this use case. Or you might have to move block their shooting unit from coming in and shooting you, so that you've staged your melee unit to then go hit their melee unit. Levels of complications there, but what I would say is that in general, having more chat on WTC is very, very good, because you can move block people and you can protect yourself via castling. Whereas otherwise, on different terrain formats, you could simply protect yourself by being 1-inch off the wall. Okay, hopefully that helped that one a little bit. So I've kind of covered the next one, which is talking about 2-inch engagement. How does it change the flow of the dynamic in the game, especially from someone who plays gunline armies that may not benefit from it? Yeah, good question. I would say in general, this is a nerf to gunline armies, right? Like, there is nothing which benefits gunline armies from having 2-inch engagement. And in fact, as a guard player for most of my career, you would use the 1-inch engagement wall off as much as possible, and it would just simply disallow people from interacting with you, right? However, if you're on WTC, you'll probably notice that if you're playing against melee armies, there are some pretty telegraphed staging locations, right? For example, let's say I'm actually playing guard, right? I'll load in... I'm actually playing guard in a TTS league, the Swedish TTS league called Vaisler at the moment, and I'm playing mechanized assault. So I'm right in the trenches with whoever asked this question. So for example, the thing about the 2-inch engagement is that yes, it's not a great thing, but WTC terrain is kind of limited in where people can actually go. For example, their big units can only go through the aforementioned places we talked about, through here, and through here. However, the ruins are quite well positioned to move block people against. For example, if I'm going second in this case, I will have my Chimera right here. I'll scout move my Chimera 6 inches. I'll probably scout move it. I'll probably start it here, scout move it 6 inches, right to here, where this angle doesn't exist. This is a very common angle, which we'll be talking about. Something like that. And then I'm going to want to prevent anything that moves in here and move block that, right? So you'll notice that this terrain piece is covered, right? The objective can be held behind the terrain piece here, but you don't get that much OC on it, right? And there's a couple of pros and cons here. You can get shot by someone deploying down here and shooting onto your objective. Then you are vulnerable to being move blocked and people putting OC on it. So I think probably this position is better to, like I had before, to disembark from. And, I would just disembark my Catachan like this and go through move blocking people, right? That's a really good way of doing it. Now, one thing that's interesting is that you can still move block or 1-inch off the wall, larger model monsters, right? For example, things that aren't infantry or tanks, you can still 1-inch engagement off the wall. There's nothing that prevents you from being against a wall like this, where a demon prince cannot hit you, right? That's still really useful. But it is definitely a downside if you're playing just a monophase shooting army, for example. Now, one thing that's really interesting is that you can also use the 1-inch engagement to your advantage if you have like a larger horde style unit. If your opponent just has a transport here, they cannot 1-inch off the wall you, right? Like this, so you can counter wrap people as well, right? So people still have to be, mindful of, if you've got 10 Catachan, you can still just move 9, and then wrap your opponent, and it's very difficult for them to stop you from actually making a charge here, despite you being against the wall. Now, there's obviously counterplay to that, because this is cut off. You can obviously have a unit here, and heroic covering your vehicle. So, lots of different plays, and we'll get into more of that when I'm talking through the maps here. Take 2. Alright, so we're talking about the board which I just loaded up, and this is take 2. This is a board which is a little bit unique because it has ruins against both. It has 2 ruins against both board edges right here. And you can see that arriving from strat reserves and shooting here is very difficult because you can hide. If you're the teal player, you can hide in this ruin, attack your opponent's objective. They cannot really arrive from strat reserves and shoot you. This is a unique map because both are closed to your opponent. Or, for example, if you're on this side, you can hide over here and deny your opponent arriving from strategic reserves, basically coming onto this terrain plate as well. The kind of difference in this map is that you can stage here, move into the middle, and then you can kind of shoot into your opponent's ruin that they're staging against you, against your ruin here as well. So most maps don't have kind of these 2 ruins against the board edges here, but that can happen. I'll load up one other map really quick. Oh, not that one. This is a good example. There we go. This map, for example, if you're the teal player, you can put a unit here. It blocks 9 inches here. But that may not prevent your opponent from rapid ingressing, moving onto this terrain plate and shooting you, for example. Likewise, if you're another player, you can kind of put your models right here, and that will prevent them from arriving 9 inches that way. So this is a good example of where a list maybe like Raven Guard might struggle to get a line of sight on the board when they actually want to arrive for reserves and subsequently shoot you. Alright, cool. That is the strat reserves covered. And last but not least, I had a question about the metagame. How would you expect the meta to change if you're on WTC versus GW and a UKTC event? Well, it's really interesting. I would expect, if I was playing a singles event on WTC, I would expect the meta to have a lot less monophase shooting armies. So I think on Games Workshop and UKTC, you do get the prevalence of armies like Triple Redemptor Stormraven, Tau, Guard gunline, Ultramarines gunlines. These armies are pretty popular and quite strong on those boards. However, on WTC, really what you're looking at, I think the king of WTC boards is, apart from Elder, going to be fast-moving combined arms armies. For example, let me just... Have I got an Iron Strider Bellistari? If I do, that'd be great. Okay, these are very old lists, including a plane, which I am not... okay, it's a very old list. 1 second. Halo V2. This doesn't have a... Okay, it doesn't have an Iron Strider Bellistari, which is really what I wanted to demonstrate at this point. But you can imagine, for example, if you had a unit of 3 Iron Strider Bellistaris, you could keep them in this pocket here. You can then jump onto the terrain plates, and then their cannons can both go over this right here, but they are tall enough to shoot over this terrain piece. So being able to stage behind here and then jump on it and unlock it to shoot down here is quite powerful. So lists that can take advantage of that, I would expect to be a bit more popular. So I think lists like AdMech are a really good example of combined arms with good fast shooting. And then, lists which have good melee units that they want to stage. For example, a Rhino in here with Bile and 10 Chosen, or just 10 Chosen in here in general, very strong because you get access to a large part of the board, right? You're always going to be able to typically trade that unit into something on WTC if your opponent wants to play on the board. However, that doesn't mean that it will live to the next turn, of course. So lists like that I would expect to perform a lot better. Slow, honest army moving lists are going to be a bit less popular. For example, like Black Templars in a singles environment, I don't think is fantastic on WTC terrain, especially with the 2 Repulsor Executioners, for example. Primarily because you are really telegraphed where you're going to go, and your movement paths are limited to being move blocked in addition to that. So you will very much struggle against armies like Eldari that can stage, a huge part of their army in the small ruin over here, have 5 rangers here, cover heroic, and then move 26 inches kind of and threaten your deployment zone and everything else that's within this kind of bubble of death. So those are armies which I think would be very strong, and armies which I think would kind of suffer a bit more. Now, one thing that's unique is that the big knights are a little bit better on WTC terrain, because actually you can imagine jumping on these terrain plates is quite good, and because these terrain plates have a lip on the outside, you can touch onto them and unlock them with the towering ability. So I wouldn't say that big models are terrible, but they do suffer a bit more outside of the aforementioned large knight variants. Okay, cool. On to the next part. We are going to be jumping straight in, I guess, to the maps. So I'm going to take a break, come back in a second, and we're going to begin with Search and Destroy. Okay, see you guys in a bit. Alright, and we are back. Okay. We're going to first talk about a couple of layouts that don't really work. So, as opposed to UKTC, the WTC doesn't really have great layouts for sweeping engagement and search and destroy. I would go and show them, and I don't think they get played at the WTC either as well. Question mark around that one, but I think you'll probably find if you are playing them, they will, well, if you are worried about playing on WTC, you probably won't find them in tournaments. So don't worry about that too much. Okay, so sweep engagement and Dawn of War, not really that common on the WTC format. You can see some of these maps. This is what I was looking for. This sweeping engagement map right here. This PDF is enormous, by the way. This PDF contains all of the maps and has a close-up image or an enlarged image of all the maps as well. You can see these maps are obviously kind of in their first iteration, and perhaps for the next WTC they will be around to play, but as you can see they're quite a bit different from the WTC maps we've been talking about that are quite angular and well designed, I would say. This map is, a lot more simplistic, I think is probably a fair way to say. Okay, so let's jump into it. We're going to first talk about, and I'm just going to consult the slides here. We're going to talk about Crucible of Battle. Awesome. I'm just going to get my TTS back open. And I'll go through all of the layouts here. And first, I think what would be good is from a high level to look at what the boards look like. In terms of the total 8 tables that you'll probably have. Now, I think for sake of argument, I'll cover the light table for some of the initial boards here. However, I think I won't cover the light table for all of the boards here because realistically speaking, if you are playing at a singles event, you'll probably not be playing on the light table. And the light table is somewhat similar in many ways. However, the objectives are usually just in the open. Okay, is it going to play nice? This PDF is enormous, by the way, so it's quite a gauntlet to scroll through. Okay. So, as you can see here, hopefully, there are 8 tables and 8 combinations. And some maps, I believe all of them actually we're talking about today, table 4 and 5 are just the same. So there's realistically 7 maps. Okay. Now 7 maps may sound like a lot of maps, right? You may think, wow, okay, that's a little bit daunting. But bear with me here, for example. We've got table 1, Thunderdome. Table 2, like Classico Angles map. Table 3, Thunderdome. Table 4 and 5, Classic Angles map. Table 6, which is a new map design, which has come out this year. Table 7, Thunderdome. And Table 8, new map. So, realistically speaking, there's Thunderdome, there's Angles, and then there are 2 other ones on top of that. So, you don't really have a huge amount to worry about here, and realistically speaking, most tournaments will either play Table 1, Thunderdome, or 2 Angles. That's the most common if you're playing an event. You can see, for example, 8 is typically the quote-unquote light table, and so is 7 here. The light table, and table 1 and 2 are quote-unquote the heavy tables. However, you'll see that the heavy is denoted primarily by the number of large ruins here. So, if you think about it, Table 8 you might not be as concerned about, Table 7 you might not be as concerned about, but that is obviously Thunderdome. And then realistically you've got the Thunderdome layout and the Angles layout, and you've got one more one, which is equally quite heavy as well. So, I will jump in because the Thunderdome map is also played on Search and Destroy, and so is the Angles map as well. So, if you want to take away one thing from this, it's that learning the Thunderdome map and learning the Angles map is the most important part for getting started on playing the WTC terrain pack. So when this loads in, I'll create a server. And here we go. Cool. So once again, I'm using the Hutber map pack. If you're looking at getting started on TTS, I do have a 20-minute video which gets you all the way from installing it to having your models actually working in there as well. So that should help you if you've got any questions around that. It has a link to all the resources in addition to that. Okay, so why don't we start it off with, this is Table 8. Why don't we start it off with Thunderdome? Now, I think Thunderdome is just what I call it, so it's either going to stick with you or it's not going to stick with you. So, Thunderdome can be played on Search and Destroy, but it can also be played on Crucible of Battle. And Crucible of Battle is what we'll cover here initially. So what I'm going to do is maybe get my list. I'm going to get two lists here. I'm going to get Imperial Guard and I'm going to get Black Templars, I think. Two armies which I've been playing a lot of recently. And Black Templars. Actually, I tell you what, I'm going to get Ultramarines and old Ultramarines actually. I'll use that for the shooting element because it has the ability to advance and shoot. And I think that'll be quite relatable. And then I'll get my Black Templars list out here as well, which is pretty combat orientated, to be honest with you. So let's just go in and look at some of the deployments for shooting armies. That's the way I'm going to structure it. I'll structure it shooting armies and then melee armies deployment, and then the key angles after that if I don't cover them, and key station ruins. Alrighty, so for this map, you can see that the objectives are kind of quite in the open here, but this angle's not super easy to shoot per se. Okay, one thing about the middle of the board is it is quite dense to shoot into. You'll probably find, for example, that if someone has a model here and I'm the teal player, the only really good way to shoot it is to move a lot closer here and shoot in down this line here. Actually moving a model up to this point here where it can shoot in here is very, very tough. So just bear that in mind when your opponent has, say, area denial on turn 1. They may put something on the terrain plate here which you can shoot, but if it's not on the terrain plate, then you're going to be cutting an even finer angle there. So you are going to need something to do there. You may shoot back down this angle, but that'll probably be close to where your opponent is staging a unit here, so you might be able to shoot them back. And I believe I might have gotten the light table here, so I'm going to go reload the map here. You can see that was, I believe, the light table. That was table 7. However, that one still had play to it, right? Like, sure, the objective was in the open. However, it wasn't as dire as it sounded. Okay, and as you can see, these maps are both very, very similar. These two maps here. There is an angular map that looks something like this. Here we go. My apologies for that. So this map has the ruins ever so slightly adjusted, where this ruin here is pushed back this direction so that it overlaps with this objective right here. But I think you'll probably find that whilst this is technically heavier, the objectives are, the staging ruins are so close to one another. So let's jump back into it. And I'll go over kind of theory for deploying a shooting army here. Okay, first thing to note is that you've got this cubby hole right here, which can give you a nice strategic reserve into, right? You can imagine if your opponent is trying to hold this one, you can straight reserve into here, jump on the terrain plate, and then shoot them, right? For example, let's say you've got a Vindicator in reserve. You can, put your Vindicator here, arrive from strat reserves, move it here. This is 11-inch movement. and then shoot down this angle right here. So maybe you just need a 1 inch advance here with the Vindicator, or you know, coming in 7 and then towing over this way right here will give you a line into there. So a nice pocket here where you can do that. However, they can put a model here and then push you back out, of course. And if you deploy it like this, you're going to need to get onto this terrain plate. So there's pros and cons to this situation of putting a unit in straight reserve, because they may move it here, and then if they charge something here, you might be blocked for getting on that terrain plate. Something to consider. Okay, now, this ruin on a, like, this is a heavy table, quote unquote. This is typically a small ruin, but it's not going to make a huge difference for us here. So the main areas which people will deploy kind of melee armies is in this central location right here. Right? You're going to deploy something there, and it's not going to be able to be shot until you get past the point here, and this angle is really tough. This angle here is here, but this is someone deploying here, moving over 13 inches, and then shooting you down here. So you can typically put a shooting vehicle right here. Maybe a unit you want to play the midboard. You know, in this list we've got like Calgar and Gilliman. This is an old list. You know, let me put Calgar here. You know, you might want to put one of your main assets here, Gilliman and Calgar. To cut this angle off here as much as possible, right? So you don't want your opponent to be able to stand here and shoot you, right? So you want to be off this line right here where these two intersect, and you don't want to be further than this blue line right here, because as soon as you're here, then someone can shoot you down there, right? Great. Now we've got something obviously you're going to stick on your home field. The next location that you want to focus deploying in is going to be this one right here. Oh, how do I erase it, please? This location right here. And this is great for any kind of skirmishing unit that you can use to advance and shoot. A ballistic dreadnought is really good here. Knowing that people can move on to here and shoot you is important. So if you really must not get shot down this angle, you know, you can cut an angle that's something like this. And actually shooting down this way is quite difficult. It looks very easy, but the best way for someone to shoot is actually from here, cutting an angle down here. So as long as you're behind that, you're kind of okay. So if someone wants to shoot you, they're going to have to get past this container right here. And even that is reasonably hard. And I've just disconnected. TTS is loving me here. Thank you very much. Hopefully I won't have to cut the video, but we'll just jump back into it. Okay. Before I was rudely interrupted by TTS. Jump in the color. Okay, so your secondary angle, which people will deploy things, is like I was just talking about there. They would have to get beyond that crate. So what you don't want to have is this line here available. So you don't want to be sort of past that line, which allows you basically this space right here, and then you can additionally like cut this angle right here roughly, right? I believe it's something like that. So that's also quite hard to shoot. So this line right here is quite hard to shoot. This line here, so you can move it even more a bit that way. So you've got one unit here, one unit there. It's going to bring back Manius. Yeah, roughly you have a unit here. This angle likewise is actually really hard to shoot, so you can actually even put them on the terrain feature here typically. Okay, so you've got some expansion pressure and you've got some midboard presence. You may want to have another good long range shooting asset right here, touching some cover. And you might, as a shooting army, be a-okay with someone shooting you on turn 1, so long as you can shoot them back. So you might be perfectly fine with having this here. One thing that's worth noting is that you can even put like a Vindicator here. That's not actually the worst. You know, this line right here exists. And this is like, they still have to come over this terrain piece to actually shoot you, to which you can shoot them back here. But obviously the Vindicator is a bit longer there. And you can see, with Devastated Doctor on turn 1, you know, a Ballistic Dreadnought could roll a 4+, or this is a 4+ right here, sort of be on the point there, and then shoot around this corner. That works out quite nicely. Or just be on the terrain piece here, and then shoot through it. Okay, awesome. Next up, we're going to think about the other side of the board now. This is where you want to have something which is going to be on a 2-turn staging threat. If you're playing a shooting army though, it is also good to have some kind of like shooting asset, well, will tanky asset be alive on this, for example? You know, typically you can move a ballistas through here, 4 inches, and then 5, 6. So this is a 10-inch movement. Will get you onto the point right here. Now, it's not always that you want to jump right onto the point here, but if you have like a heroic threat staged up in here, that can be quite nice as well. You know, you can imagine if you've got Manius right here. You know, good solid basics 40k. And then your Ballistas Dreadnought here. You know, you could potentially prevent a melee army from charging you. However, though, all they have to do is walk on here and out OCU. So what you want to do in that case is you want to pressure this side of the board down here. You really want to try and scoot something onto this side and deploy it down there. So a nice shooting asset like, I don't know, a Vindicator works really well here. A Reaper I'd probably put in strat reserve. You know, a Vindicator deployed here is quite nice. You can simply move it along the board edge here. And then next turn you've got the option to move straight through here, and then it's all smooth sailing. Holding this though might be a bit of a problem, so you may want to just try and do that with a cheap unit like Scouts, for example. Likewise, a Ballistas Dreadnought on here is quite nice, and additionally, because you can step onto the terrain plate and shoot, so you can shoot through here maybe. I don't know if there is a line. I don't think there is a line through there. Or you can go down south like this and then shoot into this feature like this as well. So that's kind of the theory behind playing a shooting army on these boards. Now this is a bit of a combined arms, but it's primarily a shooting army. You know, having a unit that can do action secondaries in the middle, you know, standard stuff. You typically will want to put, this is actually a good idea, you know, if you've got a unit like JPIs, you could put your Ballistas Dreadnought to where it could get shot if they move further down here to shoot you, and then stage your JPIs in the front here, which would give you a great option to attack your opponent's expansion on turn 1. You know, if you have JPIs like this. And then maybe one more here. And then your Ballistas Dreadnought maybe like that. That it could get shot back down this angle perhaps. But you'd probably rather get shot back down this angle. And then you might have a Gladiator Reaper sort of behind here as well. That could counter shoot. I wouldn't advise deploying that far back. But another Ballistas Dreadnought down here off that line is probably just as good as well. So that way you can counter shoot, and you've got something which can contest your opponent's objective quite easily as well. Ballistas Dreadnought can also go here and shoot onto that as well. The advantage that this list kind of has is that if you're in Tac Doctrine and they trigger within 9 inches, you know, you do have the ability to walk onto it, and this is quite hard to shoot into as well. So getting a unit like Manius into the middle here can be very difficult to shoot, because as you can see, this angle is really tough. This angle literally doesn't exist. So to shoot into the middle here, your only really good option is if you've got a unit staged, like a Ballistas Dreadnought, is to move 3 and step wholly onto this frame plate and shoot into it. So if your opponent's got a big tanky unit, like Fabius Bile perhaps, then you want to be really cautious as to counterplaying that unit if they move it into the middle here. And yes, I've lost to that before. Okay, that's kind of how we look at it from a shooting army perspective. And let's think about it from maybe a bit more of a melee army. So I'm going to be going through all the maps here, so I'm going to try and go through them a little bit, well, somewhat fast, but they'll obviously be duplicated to some degree here. Okay, so like we talked about, you have this angle right here, so you want to put a cheap trading unit right there, maybe 5 Assault Intercessors with a Castellan, or something that you want to flip an objective with and contest OC early on. So that's where we're going to go that. You can imagine scout moving is really powerful on these boards. And I would say, I didn't touch on that before, but scout moving in general, particularly on WTC boards, is very, very powerful, I would say. Because you can get close up into this ruin, you can scout move into here, and then you can easily move and then hit the unit that's staged right there. So we have one unit there, and we're a bit condensed on this board, but we do want to put something big in the middle here, and I would probably put the Repulsor Executioner in the middle here. If in doubt, I used to tell my coaching clients very often, and this kind of goes with chess theory, if you don't know where to put your big unit, put it in the middle, because if you don't know where to put your queen, put her in the middle, and at least she'll be active. And what I mean by that is, you don't necessarily know your opponent's game plan, and if you have to drop early, you might not be sure if they're going to play this side of the board or this side of the board. So if you're centralized, either way, you'll be able to play a good side of the board here. So I've got a unit there. I would probably maybe even try and put an Impulsor down here if I could. That would allow me to disembark and move, which would be really helpful, and I could potentially counter shoot it with both my repexes. The other repex I'm probably going to be putting here so that I can move it like this. They would have to go past this point right here to shoot me, and I would be something like that, and this repex would be something like this right here. As you can see, like I talked about before, playing some of these larger models can be a little bit dangerous on WTC. So like this is not able to get shot through that angle, and this is not able to get shot through that angle, so that's all good. And we can play both sides of the board with the central one, and this one can counter shoot this angle. So we've got our Grimoldus brick. Now typically I would love to put this in the position of this repex right here, but we are going to want to just forego that and just potentially try and slide it up into this position early on. So we're going to forego a little bit of turn 1 pressure with this unit, and we're just going to put it in the repex. Now, Black Templars has a decent amount of transports here, and so if you have one central unit, perhaps putting it in here is important. And then if you've got another small skirmishing unit, maybe 5 assault intercessors and a marshal as well, you know, putting that down this angle. You can never be shot right here, so that's always good. But this angle is actually very common. You'll find that there are many, there are boards that have this ruin right here, and next to, kind of away from an objective, while opposite an objective. And if you line up like this, you can touch the terrain, that's fine. And simply having your unit here in kind of this triangular formation will mean that you get the maximum amount of distance to move and then charge onto this part turn 1. So that's another part, you know, thinking about where can you deploy opposite your opponent's objectives that you're going to try and contest and their expansion, and then trying to put some of your larger assets in the middle and then centralize them as well if you don't have the deployment space necessarily. So we've got 3 kind of largest units here, and we don't want to deploy our 20 brick right back here, because if we don't roll high enough, we can't hide it all the way in there. And as you can see in this case, if we go +1 to advance and charge 2, this is going to be a 10-inch move, which is a 3-up advance for Grimoldus' unit. And that will get this entire unit right here, which then gives us a nice amount of space to play with. We can cover heroics, we can do a lot of stuff with that now that it's in that position. So that's a good example of how I would probably deploy. A couple of angles to look out for. We've talked to recap, onto here to shoot into here is good. Arriving from strike reserves from this side is quite nice because you can arrive and shoot. Arriving from strike reserves here can be a little bit dangerous because they usually want to put pressure on you from here. They might have like a rhino in here, for example. You can imagine if this Reaper is just a rhino tucked right in here. They're going to disembark over this way and attack you here. So you're going to get pushed back way here if you're planning on arriving from strike reserves from this angle. Okay, cool. And that's the main part for the Thunderdome map, is particularly on Crucible of Battle. Let's look at the next map. This is going to be a bit of a long video. Okay, we'll go with the next most common map, which is this this map right here. The kind of angles map. This is a really interesting map, and it's quite good in a lot of ways. This one's been around for quite a long time. I'll bring in my guard army this time. Alrighty, okay, let's just jump straight in. A couple of key angles here. This angle for your deployment is absolutely key, and you'll find that people will often deploy behind this line. Well, you can go like right here. There's a couple of lines you can go. If your opponent can go beyond this point, then you want to deploy back more on this line where the current blue line is. If they can't, otherwise you can sort of deploy up here where these two crates intersect on the second blue line. However, most people can, if they deploy a shooting asset here, move here and then shoot down here, right? So you usually want to play the blue line, which is this line right here. I appreciate there's multiple blue lines here. I'll just erase them all. Typically you want to play the blue line here, which is, can I remove, well, from this crate edge to this point right here. Excellent. Very helpful, enormous line there. Anyway, we'll get there eventually, team. This line right here. So you typically want to deploy things behind that line if you don't want to get shot, right? So let's say you've got like a Torox here, you know, put it up a wall here, and that's going to be what will play, you know, this objective, this part of the board here, right? So that's deployment area number 1. This area right here. Next up, I will just deploy that. Call that no. Well, anyway. Next up, you want to deploy something in this area right here. Right here. Now, it may look very open, but actually this area of the board is really closed. For example, all the way up here is actually pretty damn closed. It's actually very hard to shoot. It feels like it'll be very open. It's actually very hard to shoot someone if they've deployed right here. Now, you can walk here and shoot down here. This is true, but that's because my Rogal Dawn is absolutely enormous. For example, if you have a Chimera right here, this angle's pretty damn tight. Your opponent has to shoot, yeah, well, it doesn't exist. So if you go from this ruin here to this ruin here, you've got this area which is safe. And I'm going to color it in green. You have got this area here which is safe, right? Because your opponent has to go beyond this point to shoot you. So actually deploying in here is very good. Now, secondly to that, you can deploy behind this point right here. For example, this angle here lets you deploy something in this pocket right here as well. So you can deploy right here. That's very safe. So you've got these two kind of triangles where you can deploy, and then a third one here. This angle only exists down the board edge here up to this point here. So if you want to go for a line, I want a blue line. Helpful. You know, it's something like down here, for example, like that. You've got this area here in red, which is really just not 100% safe. But like I said before, if you've got the stronger shooting army, you might be perfectly fine getting shot on turn 1, so long as you can shoot them back, right? So in this deployment, you've got this area which is safe. And this is a good way to like kind of think about it before the game. This area which is safe. You've got this area which is safe right here. This area which is safe, and I would recommend deploying here in particular. It may seem like it's open from here, but this line just doesn't exist. So they have to get like here to shoot this Chimera right here, which is very hard. You've then got all this area up here which is safe, and of course this triangle which is safe. And actually, to be honest with you, basically deploying right here is safe as well. Basically deploying in there is safe. So you've got all that which is safe, and really just one area here if you're playing against a gun line that can actually shoot you there. But bearing in mind that would need for your opponent to either deploy safely here and then move out into the open to shoot you, which of course you can just move and shoot them back, or deploy down here with a unit that can move onto this ruin and shoot down here as well. Okay, that's the primary deployment zones, I would say, you know. Okay, a couple of things about this board if you're playing a shooting army. You really want to have something staged here so that you can shoot into this ruin right here. And you'll notice probably this is similar to the previous map we played. I really want to have like a Chimera that's scout moved here or something, and then I can disembark my guys, or I can just move and then shoot into here on turn 1. So a rule of thumb, if your opponent is holding the objective here, right, they will be on the terrain plate and you can shoot them. If they're not holding it, they'll be off the terrain plate and you will need to be on the terrain plate. So it's very good if you get well versed at kind of pre-measuring. Okay, I'm exactly 10 inches away to get the edge of my tank over this terrain plate so I can see down here, right? Or, you know, I'm exactly 10 point whatever so that if it's a move, I can move 12 and then get wholly on this terrain plate to shoot you, right? So stuff like that is really good. So as a shooting army, you want to stage against your opponent, like roughly here or something, so that you can move onto here, maybe disembark onto the plate and then shoot someone, right? So that's kind of pre-shooting your opponent, especially if you've gone first. Secondly, actually holding this objective down in this part right here is quite good. So if you want to hold this objective, for example, you're either going to hold it in a couple of ways. You can hold it by having pressure down here and having a unit right here. And this angle is actually a little bit tougher than it actually looks to shoot. particularly if you've got a lone op ability. Like this angle here is actually kind of like that, you see? So your opponent has to be right here to shoot you, or, you know, or further beyond, right? Now, what that does is it draws them into whatever's inside of this ruin, right? So you can imagine if you've got like some Kaskin or something, you know, a nice combat unit perhaps that's staged up in this ruin. When you've got pressure on your opponent like this, they're either going to have to come onto this terrain plate and shoot you, or they're going to have to come past this line to shoot you as well, which is quite tight to get. Because if they're deploying sort of here, they have to move all the way there, or they'd have to move this unit here up into here, which is obviously just going to die for free next turn. So a little cheeky angle you can sort of get, and as you see it from this perspective, it's a little bit more clear. If your opponent hasn't staged enough in here, you can just hide them down here and then force them to come into you. So this is typically like, you'll probably notice with these boards, it's not exactly obvious who has the expansion objective, because it kind of does also play around what they put into these big ruins. These big ruins in the middle here are excellently placed for staging a nice big melee unit, and you can see with, you know, a reasonable move, you can touch basically your opponent's mid ruin. You can even go for like their home ruin here. You can easily hit this objective, of course, and this one right here. So if they've kind of put their big unit in here as well, you can also just move out, boom, and you're into there. All right, this video's going to take like 4 hours at this rate. Next up, you know, holding your expansion objective, if you want to call it that, but this is just really an objective you can hold, and the tempo will kind of let you know how you want to do that. Now, if you've got a reactive move unit, I would advise disembarking first, and then reactive moving, then being on this terrain plate, then putting your transport over here, so that you can reactive move back into it if your opponent commits onto the objective, right? So if they don't commit enough onto the objective, don't reactive move. If they do commit enough, reactive move back off it, right? Like that's a really nice play. Or a little bit more of an advanced one, you can put your you know, transport on the objective right here, disembark your guys, jump out, and then be able to heroic when they charge your transport. Like that's really nice as well. Or you can do 3 layers. You can kind of have a unit here, you know, your transport here, and a unit against it as well. And then you can be able to reactor move this unit, have the transport on, heroic the transport, do lots of stuff like that. So this unit, this objective is hard to hold if your opponent wants to out OC you, but it does allow you to also stage units that go into your opponent's expansion, or your opponent's midfield ruin as well. Or if you've got a big shooting unit, you know, you will kind of want to stage it like this, right? If you've got a big shooting unit like a Dawn or a Vanquisher, you know, just putting it against here is like really nice because you get this angle right here. And hopefully this is kind of shown because of these tight corridors, you know, how important it can be to just have a move blocking unit on WTC. Like 5 Rangers or 10 Kato-chan are absolutely excellent at that. You can imagine someone blocking this, like for example, if I've got a big melee unit in here, they can block this and then out OC me. Or if I've got a big melee unit in here, they can put their unit here, out OC me and block me here, for example. Okay, that's the angles map for Crucible of Battle. And will probably feel quite similar for the Search and Destroy map as well. Alright, awesome. I guess a few comments for melee armies. You know, putting your melee units in here obviously is good. Just deploying in the same locations, right? You know, you want to deploy here, move into here. There is a really good angle here as well. If you're a melee unit, you can hide, or if you're any army really, you can hide this angle right here. You know, it creates this triangle, which is very good to hide in. It's very close up. They have to get past this point to see you, and if they can move so far, you can put that line there and deploy in here as well. So a nice little angle there, and you know, generally speaking, being tucked up in here is good, but just be aware of your opponent shooting you from this direction here, and being in here is completely safe, but you are move blockable, and it might be a little bit obvious if your opponent has lots of good move block options against you. Alrighty. I think when I talk about those maps on the Search and Destroy, I'll probably just talk about the primary differences for the Search and Destroy map. Whew, gotta hydrate. Okay, where are we? Search and Destroy. That's the open map. We've covered Thunderdome. This is the new map. I've covered that. We have covered this. We've covered that. And you can kind of see, like, in 2 maps, we've covered most of them. So I'll just go over this map briefly. This map is a bit of an interesting one, and this is definitely a map where if you have big models, they will definitely struggle. Now, I think it probably looks very open when you think about it, because of this line that exists right down the board. But there are a couple of things on this map which make it difficult to attack your opponent's expansion objective. Let me bring in my Black Templars list. And this map is like a really good example of why I would probably change, if I was going for a really serious singles run, my Black Templars list for WTC specifically. So, to drive, for example, your Repulse Executioner, you can only really deploy it in a couple locations, here and here, and it doesn't actually go through this part of the board here, which is a shame. You would have to actually put it above this terrain plate here, and then advance over to get it over here, right? But that costs you 4 up and 4 down. So you'd be losing 8 inches when you move 10, so 2 inches here, you need to roll like probably a 4-inch advance to get over there, for example. So, that's the problem with big maps. Big things on this map in particular. Now, next thing about this map is it's actually quite hard to strat reserve units in, because these crates are placed right here. And this angle's quite wide open, right? And it's very close to your opponent's expansion objective. So, for example, if your opponent has, you know, some dudes here, you'll notice that this unit here is extremely difficult to shoot. Right, it may not be on your expansion objective, but it is pretty much impossible to shoot here. So if you've also got another unit like right here, then no one's deploying to come down here and shoot this angle. It just doesn't exist. It's very easy to block off. So you're going to deploy some units back here, like this. And your opponent might be able to shoot you all the way down here, but it's like a 48-inch gun. But if they can't deploy your intercessors like this. If they can, deploy them back like this, and they may be able to shoot you down here, but like that's quite tough because they're usually deploying for this side of the board and to play the middle, for example. So 2 easy ways to do that. You've got your intercessors there. Now you can imagine if you're trying to attack this objective right here, you've got to get through this unit here before you can actually get onto this objective, and to shoot, like you need to be completely exposed on this point to shoot down here, where your opponent can then move out and counter shoot you very, very, very easily. So the trick to holding some of these objectives here is, and you can even put like a guy on here, like these guys here are, you can even fit another unit on here. You know, for example, if you've got a screen blocking right here, like this unit is actually really hard to shoot as well, because the only angle to shoot you is kind of, I mean, like not even there, it's kind of back down here, which is just really hard to shoot. So that's kind of the key to playing this one. Like, don't maybe just put your whole unit in the open here, but just hold it on the other side, on the outskirts of the objective, like this. Strat reserves are hard because your opponent can have a little bit of shooting if you have big things in strat reserve, or they just kind of naturally block it, right? Like you're naturally just blocked out here, and you've got this giant container in the way, so you can't really strat reserve a vehicle on this map, right? This is again why this double repulse executioner really struggles on this map. You have to deploy it here, which does not get you anywhere, right? You have to strat reserve an infantry unit, right? And if you don't want to get shot, you have to be behind this crate here, right? Otherwise, if you're right here, you know, you're eligible to be shot. So strat reserve is very hard on this map. This map's very, very defensible and very drawish in general, I think. Next up, this ruin is reasonably hard to shoot into. You know, you've got a pretty closed angle here, and you've just got this angle here. But think about it like this. I would have had to have staged my good shooting units in here, right? So I would have to have driven my tank all the way down here first. Then I would have to have moved it here to shoot into there. It's actually quite hard to do. So this ruin is quite hard to shoot into, despite it looking and feeling quite open. Particularly because you can do, like, they can't shoot on your early turns, and if they are maneuvering a piece here, you can simply move your unit onto this ruin here afterwards. Staging is good into this ruin, but it doesn't effectively do much. So you want to get as much onto this objective as soon as possible. Now, attacking your opponent's expansion can be reasonably tough, and you've got sometimes better options to simply just go this direction right here, actually. If you're a melee army, going for your opponent's home field can sometimes feel a lot easier than going across this side of the map, for example. Which is why you want to be as proactive in this ruin as possible. You do want to have stuff in here, because it's going to threaten an attack onto this objective and keep your opponent honest. So that's this map. I mean, deploying in this map is pretty straightforward. As you can see, it's very, very dense in the deployment zone, right? There's no angle whatsoever like into here. So you're completely safe to deploy like in any of these parts here. You know, like here, here, here. These are all basically completely safe places to deploy. Your opponent has to vastly overextend to do it. The only thing is, like, these angles down here do exist. So down here exists, right? It's kind of no man's land in these parts of the board, right? So as long as you're not deployed there, you're absolutely fine. And you can have a scout. Any scout move that can go back here or forward is pretty nice as well. Now there is like one more cute staging ruin, which is that you can stage sometimes outside your opponent's natural expansion right here. You can imagine if I was playing Black Templars, and let me just get rid of all the markings here. You can imagine if you had like a Rhino, or maybe maybe you had like an Impulsor with 6 Victrix Guard that could scout move 6. You can imagine if you put this right here. It's actually very hard to shoot, right? They have to come out here and shoot down this line, which is going to be difficult because it's very unlikely they deploy a key shooting piece right here, because where is that going to go over 2 turns? But if you disembark then as well, putting a unit just outside here, let's say for example, you know, these were Victrix Honor Guard. Putting a unit outside here is actually very, very hard to shoot, especially if it's a tough and durable one. So you can actually stay, if you're a Black Templars player right here, or any kind of shooting army player here, if your opponent stages a unit right here, and they've done it well, which is to say they haven't just left this angle down the middle of the board, it's actually really hard to see. For example, this angle right here is really, really tough to get. You're gonna have to put your tank right here, even further, and you can even draw a line here where you just can't see beyond. So if you can't move down this area, right, because you can't move a tank through here easily, and you need to be past this point here to shoot, it's really important to just make sure you can keep someone honest by moving a tank here and then moving it onto the terrain plate like this. But as you can see, deploying a Repex is kind of impossible on this part because this ruin is far too close. So you need to deploy it like here, and that's tough. So if you're playing against a shooting army, try and consider putting a unit outside your opponent's expansion objective like this, but it is quite hard to stage here on turn 1. So there's pros and cons to that. But if you do go first and you do get in there, it's going to be really, really hard to dislodge. Okay, awesome. I think that kind of covers Crucible of Battle. That was a long one. Let's just keep going. I'm gonna go for Search and Destroy next. I realize the shooting army, combat army thing kind of went out the door a little bit on the last one, but I'll try to cover both at the same time. Okay, Search and Destroy. Well, let's go with this map because this is the new map. That's this map right here. Okay, this one looks a bit funky, but I'll give you some pretty easy takeaways for it. Alright. This map looks dense, and it is dense in the right places. So, first of all, what are some of the common angles? Well, if you're a shooting army, you're going to want to move down here and shoot into your deployment zone here. I will get my Black Templars army, and I'll just do a bit of deployment, so we kind of know what we're looking at. This is a map where you have to put a Repulse Executioner in reserve as well. Well, depends how aggressive your opponent is. If they're very aggressive, you shouldn't put it in reserve. And yeah, that's kind of the basics right there. I probably would have put Grimaldus's brick in here. Probably have to put this back here. You know, these have characters attached, etc. on them. Yeah, sure. Okay. First up, there is a line through the middle of the board. Is there? I forget these days. Yeah, I'm pretty sure there is. See if I can make this small. Yep. Yeah, there is a line through the middle of the board, but it is very thin. What that kind of means is that you can't really deploy something. There is like a side that you can deploy on. So you can kind of deploy in this area right here, this area like right here, but you can't like put something right in this line of sight. Okay, next up. This part here looks really crap, but it's actually pretty good. You can deploy intercessors like touching this terrain piece, and you can't really be shot here. And even the impulsor there is kind of difficult to be shot. If you put it like here, your opponent kind of has to... Oh, they can shoot you down here, but what I was going to say is that you can deploy units touching this terrain feature, and you're still okay. So you can deploy quite a bit here. I think you can also deploy a rhino here as well. A normal rhino will fit, but I don't think an impulsor fits. So like a big unit of sword brethren, for example, will definitely fit in this space here, and use this extra 1 inch that you get here as well. So in fact, I think, well, a good example is going to be Grimaldus' brick, for example. If I want to talk about a larger unit that you can deploy there. You can see maybe on this terrain right here. Off this terrain. And if you've got a scout moving unit, it's just ideal if you just want to put it right here. That's really fantastic. But as you can see, quite comfortably, not even optimized for space or anything. You can put Grimaldus' unit right here. So that's quite good. You can deploy a big unit in there. Next up, you're going to want to deploy something on this line right here. You could either touch the terrain or not. It doesn't make a huge difference. If you touch the terrain, then they can obviously see like this part of you, but on a Repex, it's quite large, so it doesn't actually matter that much. It just means that they're going to shoot you anyway. So you need to be prepared to be shot down this angle on turn 1 if you've got anything kind of relatively deployed here. So if you're playing a shooting army, this map's kind of nice. You can deploy things like Ballista Dreadnoughts, Vindicators right down the line here, and then advance down the board edge and then shoot into your opponent's deployment zone on turn 1, right? Pros and cons to that. If your opponent does go first, they're going to put their enormous unit in here, which, if it can take a little bit of a beating, will then have direct access to basically all parts of the board. So something to consider there. But this is definitely the strongest angle to shoot down. And I would say in general, this map's probably one of the strongest shooting angle maps on the WTC, especially one that's not like a light board centric, for example. Because you can deploy right here, and you can get like another Ballista Dreadnought in here. So you can imagine if you advance this one first, 6, and you roll a 4, which is a 10, which is 12-inch movement, sorry. 6, this is just like a 1-inch advance. You've got 2 things to be right on that ruin right there, and it's quite hard for your opponent to barrel the way down the objective here, particularly if you've got, say, Manius and co. Right in this ruin as well. That can heroic. So that's nice. And actually getting to your expansion objective can be a little bit tough here as well. For example, the Black Templars player, they want to get something onto here, but they also don't want it to get shot from this giant angle right here. So one of the best ways you can do that is just run them up this way. But you can see like this distance is quite far. That's like a 12-inch move. So for this map here, you really do need some kind of infiltrate. It's really, really key. Okay, the good part is, when your opponent attacks this expansion objective, right? Let's say I'm the Ultramarines player. Well, the best way for me to attack it is just to put stuff on it, right? It is completely closed and really far distance to reach to get onto this unit right here. So if you've got a good fights first melee unit and you can sneak it onto this point, really, really hard to, basically impossible to dislodge. You can imagine it's really hard for knights, for example, to actually kill what's behind this ruin. They just have to simply step on it. Okay, so deploying here, here, maybe here if you're trying to get a fast unit, but ideally you want to infiltrate. And realistically, you want to start jamming stuff right into these ruins here. So if you're a melee army, you know, you're talking about going right into here. There is this angle that exists, so this is definitely one to be very kind of present about. They can step onto this terrain feature and onto this terrain feature. So these two terrain features both counter shoot each other, right? Boom, boom. So, you know, you can be in a little bit of a bind if you don't have a good amount of honest shooting on this board in particular. Because, for example, if you're here, you can get shot down this angle. If you're on this piece, you can get shot through this angle right here. But once you get to your expansion, you're generally okay. And one thing that does kind of occur is that you can, when your opponent is coming in for these deeper angles, like to shoot into here, like they are somewhat close to you. So if you've got a unit staged right here, like some assault intercessors, like there where they need to cut a line to shoot you, you know, they're probably not going to wipe a unit. They need to be right here. They are going to be within, you know, kind of 16 inches of you, so you will get counterplay right there as well. But this is probably one of the maps that can create more problematic games, I would say, out of any map, simply because of the kind of angles of that it can come from just shooting down the side of the board. So something definitely to be prescient about. And if you've got move blocking here is just insanely strong. For example, if I had scouts deployed right here, and I could, you know, jump up and move block my opponent like this, and then sneak another good melee unit into this objective, extremely hard for them to dislodge, especially because I would also have filled up this ruin, maybe this ruin with some sword bros, so that they can't cut the angle like that, for example. And remember, if they're stepping on here to cut this angle, you're going to hit them with the unit that's right in the objective, near the objective right here. And this objective marker does overlap with the ruin here as well. So you can bring people really close to you on this one if you're a melee army, but you are kind of vulnerable, particularly if you go second against a melee army and you don't have any shooting on the board, which is why, coming back around to it, you do really want to probably start your shooting pieces on the board. You know, one kind of here, one up here is fine, just so they can counter shoot each other. Okay, that's one of the new maps that was made this year. Let's carry on. Wayward Sun. Okay, Thunderdome. Thunderdome. Right. Now, this map is a little bit different, but it has some commonalities on it, right? Let me just load up kind of BFS, what I played. Huh. Or perhaps I should load up Vitrix Guard. Oh, I haven't got that. Okay. This map plays pretty similarly, but you're going to get some friendlier options in terms of staging your big units, particularly when it comes to the middle of the board. You can see, for example, this unit right here, completely untargetable. You can get the middle point, and your opponent will probably have their big unit kind of diametrically opposite your unit at all times. Yeah. Same similar staging points for this one. Boom, you're going to go there. If you've got a scout move, going from here to here is extremely good. And you can see like the distances between these ruins staged and the objective are not very far at all. One of the questions you can get is, how do you actually hold this objective? And the best way to do that early on is to have some kind of infiltrate where you can infiltrate on here, for example. Some scouts work really well, you know, starting here, walking onto it. And your opponent doesn't have the easiest time. One little thing you could do when you're holding this objective is put, say, 3 scouts here, and then you put the rest on this side of the terrain. And the angle here is pretty slim. For example, if they don't have the capability of walking onto the terrain piece, the angle they have to cut is kind of like this, right? Which is pretty damn hard. You can make it even smaller if you put one more guy just like this. And this is pretty commonly what people will do, and it's what I'd really advise you to do if you're just starting out on this terrain format. So that kind of line there is even more extreme, and you can have one more there. And sometimes people will put them like this if they want to go off the terrain, just like that. And you're using your 2-inch coherency to hold that one there. But of course that's pretty fragile. So what you want to do is scoot a piece down here, deploy it on the line, like maybe a cheeky little Vindicator. Move this down here on turn 1, maybe roll like a 4, and then you just simply move like this, 2.5, 3, and then on the terrain plate is 10, 12 on 3 up advance, and then you're counter shooting what's in that ruin. If you want to hold this expansion, your opponent will typically put a counter, a piece like this, right? You can imagine for us, for example, we would love to have, maybe Gilliman down here, Gilliman and Marnius, that's a lot of threat, right? You can have Gilliman lone opt here, right? Marnius here, Gilliman here, and that's actually quite a lot of threat to overload someone within here, like, putting these 2 guys in here, right? Gilliman's still in loan op range right here. And you get a lot of pressure against your opponent's expansion. So you can imagine if we were trying to hold ours with our scouts, you know, that's a lot of pressure we're going to have to think about on a 2-turn sequence. How do we remove this objective? I talk about this a lot in the shooting masterclasses, kind of tying together these 2-turn sequences where you're going to be moving and then identifying the pre-staging ruins that you can shoot into for a 2-turn sequence. That's a good example of that. Now, these boards here, you know, the shooting angles are not stellar, right? Your opponent will have to deploy on the line, move here and shoot you, which they can do. I'm not saying they can't, but they will deploy on the line and they need a good advance to get past this part. And if you really want to be safe, you can be on this secondary green line right here and deploy in here, for example. It's very difficult for your opponent to actually like deploy it's very difficult for your opponent to deploy on the line here, move, and then shoot you, because it's seldom that people have scout moving units that shoot, maybe like Kaskin can, for example, into this ruin right here, right? And even then, you know, they scout 6, they get out, they move 9, they're maybe like right here, you know, I mean, just they're 10 guardsmen, maybe like Overwatch or something. But it's quite rare to have that happen. It doesn't obviously happen with any of the Ultramarine shooting pieces, for example. Other than that, this map plays like really, really similarly. You know, key things to watch out are the objectives. You want to have as much pressure as possible. You want to focus on being able to remove threats from here and here if you want to hold your expansion objective. And you want to focus on having your own well-layered threats in here. Likewise, not being able to get shot from here is excellent. Which is where, again, move blocking units that can block pieces from being on the terrain piece are really important, so that you can pre-stage your units to knock people out as well. Alright, that's the Thunderdome map. Let's keep smashing it. Okay. Angles map. This is probably one of my favorites, I think, to play Search and Destroy on. I think it leads to really high quality games. Awesome. So, this map here. A couple of things. Now, you can imagine we've got a lot of deployment zone space here and a lot of deployment zone space down here. However, this angle still exists nonetheless, right? Remember we talked about in the first part for Crucible of Battle, we talked about this angle right here. So you're not really going to be able to use as much of your deployment zone space as you would otherwise think you would be able to. For example, deploying in here, if your opponent has kind of good shooting units, deploying in here is kind of death, right? You don't want to do that. Likewise, you know, the angle still stays the same. The angle here is very hard to get. So for example, they need to deploy on the line here, move down into you here to then shoot past this point here. So I would recommend not deploying in here if they have a really key unit, and instead staying off this line, generally speaking. This is where kind of scout moves can be even more exemplified, right? You don't really want to be in this area if your opponent has the ability to come down here and then shoot you all the way down here, right? But what that does do is it leaves a bunch of your deployment zone like relatively good. So you don't really want to be on this line here either, sorry. Now that I'm thinking about it, that line there. Yeah, that line there. So, I take it these points are... Let me get rid of this big green one. It's not helping. Let me just do this angle once again. So if your opponent's going to move, they're going to move a shooting piece like here, 10, which is going to mean that they can shoot down this angle right here. So you don't want to be shot from kind of this angle. And this is where, like I was talking about before, kind of the amount someone moves, this is a really good example of it. The amount someone moves is actually important here, rather than them being able to get past a certain point, right? Because they might have like, let's just think about this for example. They might have, you know, 3 Ballistus Dreadnoughts, right? They might have L triple O Ballistus Dreadnoughts right here, right? And that might be, okay, cool. Well, this one can move, you know, 8. It's been actually ages since I played them. They move 8, right? They move 8, yeah, cool. This one can move 8. And then this one can move 8. But for them to get the angle, they, might not all roll the advance to get here. So they might not all roll like a 4 up to get here. Then this is like a 4 up. And then this one can't actually move there, right? So it might look like they get 3, but they only get 2, right? So that's something to be aware of. And you can see this angle right here. You can deploy something right in here. Okay, and then this angle kind of cuts down through here, So if you deploy off this line, you're completely safe, which is, it doesn't leave you a lot to deploy here. But this angle here, if they put stuff in here, it can be countershot by anything that's deployed safely in this region right here, right? So I would advise, actually, you should deploy here, and then you can deploy back here as well. So if we think about this, if we really, 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 really don't want to get shot on turn 1, deploying back here is always good. I think basically this angle is like always safe, more or less. And then deploying in here is good. And deploying in here is good. And deploying in here is good. What this does, and then deploy something in here as well. And what this does, like 5 intercessors are quite hard to shoot right in this pocket right here. What this does is it gives you the ability to move back here and counter shoot, move back here naturally and counter shoot, move back into here, and maybe on the terrain plate and counter shoot. What that means is that you're going to be moving your units in this area right here, right? You're then going to move your units into this region right here, which is where you kind of want to be anyway, right? You kind of want to be in this region right here, yeah? So you're going to naturally move into here and then counter shoot backwards on the very closest line right here. So it looks a bit grim from the deployment zone if your opponent deploys everything on the line, but it's actually not as bad as it seems. Righty-ho. Let's go to holding expansions. Okay, there's a couple of cheeky angles on this map right here. One angle is holding the objective completely behind this line right here. Okay, so you can hold it right here. It looks in the open, but actually it's really hard to shoot this. Let's say we're playing a shooting army and we've deployed, I don't know, like a Vindicator behind this line so we don't get shot down the board turn 1. Me getting over to here is really hard. I have to get past this point right here, which is beyond my max movement. Or deploying here, I need to move like onto this terrain piece. This is a 15-inch move right here, which for a Vindicator is quite hard. And then I can count, and then I can shoot there maybe. I don't even know if I can shoot there, so maybe I'd have to come down an inch. So it's like a 6-up advance to get there. So if I've deployed safely, I'd have to move there to then shoot that. This area, generally speaking, is really good. And there's another kind of unit here where you can put it. Eldari players love to kind of have this one that I just showed and this one like up here. Well, any kind of army that's fragile and has small unit counts, they love this one right here. This angle is actually quite hard to shoot. They need to be kind of beyond this point, which means they need to basically be able to clear this terrain piece. As you can see, the Vindicator currently can't see it. So it needs to be kind of right there-ish beyond the terrain piece to be able to see just the edge of the base there. Excellent. So that's kind of how you can hold your expansion objective really easily. And the rest of it does play out pretty similarly to like what I said before. The main difference on the search and destroy map is that this objective is not on the ruin, right? So the whole counterplay of like, I'm on the ruin, I'm on the objective, therefore you can see me because I'm on the terrain plate, doesn't really apply so much. These big ruins just become massive staging pieces, right? Like you stage everything here, you can stage everything here, and if you're a melee army, you're staging both things here and maybe something against your opponent's objective, like a rhino, something small here. Really, really hard to deal with. And you can even stage something like right here in this little pocket right here, once again off the exact line like that, where they'd have to get to here to shoot you. So stage in here and here, and deploy in areas like this, here, here, here a little bit, and here if they haven't put the shooting to disrespect you, and then be off this line here and have the ability to move from here. Putting a big unit in here, just be aware that it can mean that you're going to be off this terrain piece. So if you've got like, just call this like one big unit. If you've got this unit like here, for example, you probably want to deploy it like somewhere like this, and then maybe 1 or 2 guys outside here, because you're going to want to move into here, and this is going to be like a 11-inch move, which is a pretty big advance for a Space Marine unit. So you might be like that, but you might end up trailing a few guys kind of behind here off the terrain piece, in case you don't want to get shot down this angle straight away. Okay, that's angles. So I think that is search and destroy done. Let's go over to tipping point. And all the tipping point maps are new, so it's gonna be a long one. as you can see, these two maps we're not going to be talking about. Tipping point. Okay. These maps are kind of interesting as well. So this is the layout 8, by the way. And as you can imagine, it's pretty open, but it's not as like completely open as your other ones otherwise would be. So yeah, they're not the worst in the world. This one is obviously like completely open. And then we get to the more serious maps here. Or the more singles orientated maps, I should say. Okay, I'll probably get out the Black Templars again here. And as you can probably imagine, this one's pretty defensible, especially if your opponent has deployed and moved correctly. Alright, there are some pretty obvious parts of this map, I think, right? You know, holding your expansion, you know, deploying in here and moving in here. It's pretty straightforward, right? Your opponent can, if you deploy right here, for example, I'll just get straight into it. Deployment zones. If you deploy right here, your opponent can counter shoot you down this angle, but that is pretty hard to shoot 50 inches with any decent amount of volume. So you're pretty safe there. You're obviously safe really here. This plays really obviously. You deploy something here and you move it here into this ruin right here, right? Fantastico. Your opponent cannot drive a tank down this board edge to shoot into here, so that's also really good as well. Okay, so you get your melee infantry unit and you whack it right there. If you ever want to hold your expansion, you just put it right on the board edge, and if you've got fight on death, you're singing happy days, because the only way to breach this is basically by putting more OC on it or slamming into it with a melee unit yourself, right? So, you know, I don't know how much OC I can get on this one. I could probably get one more model on if I really tried. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 probably. So, you know, a nice 16 OC there. This is so hard to shoot into, it's crazy, right? For example, it's very difficult for us to move a tank through here and then shoot down this angle right here, right? So imagine that's how hard it is for your opponent as well, right? You can move over and above this thing, but that still obviously takes a lot of movement off as well. So as you can imagine, shooting onto this part of the board here is pretty difficult with a unit that just moves this far and shoots there. Okay, next up. What your opponent will do though, and this is why this is a great melee map, is deploy a bunch of stuff here that's eligible to move into this ruin and move into this ruin right here. So there's a key shooting angle. A lot of people will put their shooting units like right here. They might put like a couple of melee units in here, and maybe like an impulsor sort of here-ish, I want to say. Something like that maybe. And they're going to be able to move here and then shoot down this line right here, right? So, you want to deploy off that line. And your opponent might be able to typically get, like they move out, they might be able to get like here or something. So, you're just going to put a little green line across here. And go behind this line. I don't know why it's not letting me do that. One little bit at a time. We will get there. You know, something like this. And you're going to have your big unit here ready to go into there. Now, what I would really advise doing, there's obviously like this angle here down the middle of the board. So don't deploy your stuff that can get shot right here. So, you know, don't deploy your stuff right here. This is bad. What you really want to do is disembark your unit from your impulsor, maybe some sword brethren. You know, they're going to move mid 9, so let's say I roll a 4. 13 inches gets me roughly here. Then you're going to, you know, maybe roll an advance on this unit right here. 6, I'm a god gamer. 12, if I didn't deploy it terribly. God Gamer followed just by if I didn't deploy it terribly. You could put that unit there, or you could just drive your impulsor up here, maybe rotate it into this corner, and you've got Dabadoo, something like that right away, right? So you've already got 2 melee units staged right opposite your opponent's objective, and you can imagine with the no 1-inch BS off the wall, that's a lot of pressure, right? So you can just keep doing that. Then next time this unit moves up, recycle another unit in there, right? Boom, go in there. Or you can kind of cut this angle here, which is from here all the way to here. And if you're behind that, you know, they can't really shoot you across the board there. Or if they can't get wholly on this terrain plate, the angle is a little bit better. It's kind of like that, right? So you can sneak a little melee unit in here. So if you're in here, this is kind of like a 11-inch-ish movement to get into here. That's kind of how you play this board. I mean, it's a bit of a wacky one. The middle is just a complete kill zone, and it's really good for melee. So you can imagine an army like Black Templars is pretty awesome here, where you can hold your expansion objective quite easily, and then you can slam into your opponent's expansion reasonably well. Shooting is not amazing on this board, so yeah, it's a bit of a tough one for shooting armies. And strat reserves is terrible on this board, especially for shooting armies on top of that. So if you're playing a melee army, this is the board for you. Alrighty, on to the next one. Okay, tipping point again. It's that one. This board, by the way, is more or less exactly the same. But there are a couple of key differences. It's actually been a while since I played on the tipping point ones. And a lot of them have been revamped. This one is... Yeah, I remember that one. Give me 1 second here. I'm just trying to see which ones are exactly the same. They are basically all different. Okay. Tipping point's got a lot going on. Alrighty. Just get the Black Templars out again. As you can see, I'm a big fan of Black Templars. They're good fun. They're quite honest army though. Alright, this board is crazy, dude. 1, 2, this is the heavy board for tipping point. Yeah, this board is wild. Some pretty common themes here for this one though. Big melee unit in here. This is extremely hard to shoot. For example, right here, you know, that's hard to shoot, right? They have to get, you know, come closer to you to shoot you here. So as long as you're off this line right here, you want to be green. You know, make sure they can't go 1, 2, 3, like sort of like this. You can deploy in this cubby right here, which is great. Or you can, and additionally, you can deploy right here. So you want to make sure you're kind of off, once again, I guess this angle, if they're right here, you want to be off these two angles right here. So deploy in here and deploy in here. That's all good. This angle in here is completely in the open. Do not deploy here. So I'm going to go back to the circles. Green circles for where it's good to deploy. Right here and right here. That's all good. This angle here is actually like kind of open as well if you've got a big unit. So actually deploying a repulsor execution on this board sucks, right? Like you're going to have to deploy it. That's in the open. Strat reserve it so you can bring it in here probably. But strat reserve to come shoot here is terrible, right? Like that's basically impossible right there. Well, that is impossible. So strat reserving it here and then, you know, stormer firing, what with Dev Doctrine to get here is okay, but your opponent can simply just hide in this big ruin right here. So another board where Rep-X's really struggle, I would advise if you've got a big unit, you know, I mean, you have to strat reserve one in this case right here. You cannot deploy it anywhere else. Maybe if you've got more drops in them, you can deploy it here and then try and scoot it up into the middle of the board here. Once you get to the middle of the board, it's quite easy. So if you've got a big thing, if you can get it to the middle of the board, like that's ideal. Otherwise, there are some really big problems on this board. If you're in a shootout versus a shootout, you're going to have to consider a couple of things. Like here is dead zone. You don't want to deploy there. Here is really tough. There is actually an angle here, which I've seen people use before as well, which is this angle down the middle of the board is actually kind of hard to shoot. So you've actually got a nice little green zone right here. And I'll demonstrate it hopefully with some assault intercessors. Like you've got this one right here. So this is a little bit of an interesting angle. And sometimes the crates are like okay like this. And you can actually hide like a randomly tall unit behind them sometimes. There we go, like that. And I'll just put one more here for the character. You can imagine this is actually reasonably hard to shoot because, you know, you need to get this angle right here. You kind of need to get right there. And for your opponent to do that, they have to scoot around this point here. Well, they have to deploy it in the open and then come past this point to then shoot down there. So you've got a nice little staging ruin here. And it's actually, the problem with this one is that it's actually really hard for you to go 2.5, 3.5, and then roll in advance. A 2. Welcome to playing Space Marines Combat. you move like there, like it's still really far away from the back of the objective. In fact, it's undeclarable to the back. So, you know, you need a very fast unit if you're going to deploy it here. Otherwise, you're going everything from here into here. If you're playing a melee combat army, you're going, your entire army is in these two, like 1, 2, 3 ruins, and they're all going into this area right here, right? Combat army, you want to go almost everything here, right? A boatload of stuff here, and here's where a lot of people go wrong with the macro strategy on this one. They try and attack their opponent's expansion objective. You can do that from here, that's doable. But what's actually easier is if you just go for your opponent's home ruin. Like this is a 10-inch move from your opponent's home ruin, and then boom, you're hitting their home ruin. So since this one is pushed so far forward, this ruin right here, what you want to try and do is stage into there and then threaten their home ruin that way. Like for example, if your opponent has stuff in here, yeah, they can threaten you right down here. It's not actually that far. So that's kind of how you play this map. And hopper, gonna get back to it. Next map. My voice is starting to go. Gonna be about 3 hours of recording this today, I think. Talked about it. We've talked about it. And we've just discussed... No, we have not discussed this one. Cool. If you're listening this far, you know, I hope you appreciate it. Check out 40kfireside.com. Alrighty. This board here is another... I mean, these boards are crazy good for melee, right? The last board we looked at was actually quite range-centric, but this board here is another melee blast-off, right? Very dense to deploy. Ruins are very close to each other, and they're completely closed to your opponent. Having said that, you can still see how, like, playing 2 repulse executioners is actually kind of hard on these boards. You don't really get a lot of rain to deploy them and move them very aggressively. Like you can see, a repulse execution on this board doesn't actually do much against your opponent's expansion objectives, right? Like, they keep people honest, but they don't do a lot of damage. So, in that case then, let's get to it. A couple of angles to... I mean, these boards kind of play themselves, right? In a certain sense. Like, you're going to deploy in here, and you're going to move everything into this ruin right here, right? Pretty straightforward. This ruin here is okay to deploy something in. In fact, you can put a Repex, say, like here. That's, you know, if you don't have the guy on top, maybe I think it fits there, but you still have the aerial. So, like, you can, in some cases, put it there, and it can sometimes be hard to shoot, but maybe you want to be off it just like this. Like, this angle, basically, this angle does exist, but you need to be right here in the open for it as well to actually be shot. So, like, this is really good here. Deploying here is a no-go. You want to deploy, obviously, in like these locations right here. And you're kind of trying to go in here and then just trade onto your opponent's objective. Really good for melee, this one. Terrible for shooting, this one. And pretty good for strat reserves, I would say. Strat reserving a vehicle is terrible, obviously. But, you know, if you strat reserve a melee piece, you're going to be able to come in here and then heroic if your opponent wants to come in, right? For example, you're going to be able to strat reserve onto the objective here. If your opponent is charging you here, maybe they're like 9 inches away, it's just back here. You're going to have to strat reserve onto here, and then heroic your unit covering 6 inches, which is this purple line like that. So a really good play if you want to try and make it. And if they're not being respectful enough, you can strat reserve into your ruin here additionally, and then just come in and slam them. So strat reserve for infantry combat, really good on this one. Strat reserve for vehicles, much less so. In fact, I would try and get my vehicle maybe deployed in here, try and get it into this position, and then try and get it here where it can counter shoot into their ruin maybe, shoot down here maybe, keep people honest perhaps, but it doesn't really have a lot of purposes outside of its OC and taking up space on the objective. I would maybe just try and heroic onto it, for example. A good idea of like thinking about how your vehicles might be worth a lot more points, but because of the terrain, they might not actually be able to function very well at all. So then try and use them for a secondary purpose that you can get the maximum amount of value out of. Alright, tipping point. The hammer and anvil maps are a little bit... I would say they're a little bit better designed because I've had a little bit more time to refine them, I would say. I mean, all the maps are pretty well designed. But tipping point has some ones which are a little bit hard to function with some armies. We have covered this map. No, we haven't covered that one. Give me 1 second. This map here is ultra dense, and this map here is the same. I'm just trying to think about which maps we haven't covered. Oh, we have covered this map, sorry. This one. So Tipping Point actually has a lot of different ones. Hammer and Anvil has more similar ones, I would say. So yeah, I mean, this map is eerily similar to the last one we played. You know, I'm not going to cover this one too much because it's very, very similar. Don't deploy in the open here. Put your melee units all in here. Reserve shooting is pretty abysmal here in addition, so try and get value wherever you can there. But you can hit your opponent's expansion very easily from the middle objective. So you can both play your opponent's expansion objective right here. And this is a really good trick, is if you are pushing like a melee unit here to try and, you know, threaten their expansion objective, you can go there. Or you can additionally put a unit into here and then hit their home field. This is a 6-up advance, and you're basically on their home field ruin. So if you're playing opposite and your opponent's got a melee unit staged right up in here, then they've always got the threat of attacking your home field. So you don't necessarily need to go like this way where you hold this one. Well, this way where you hold this one and then you attack this one. You know, you can actually go into here, right? And then over to here. So you're playing kind of you're playing here with a lot, here with a bit, and then you're trying to attack in this direction right here. Much better way to play, I think. Alright, that's Tipping Point. Let's go to the last map. Sorry, we kind of zoomed through Tipping Point, but a lot of them are pretty self-explanatory in the way they play. I think those maps on Tipping Point are a lot more self-directional than the other kind of than the other Search and Destroy and Crucible of battle maps, which are a lot more dynamic to play on, I think. They're a lot more balanced in terms of shooting and combat, whereas the Tipping Point maps are a lot more binary, I think, in terms of which they're good for. Okay, talking about binary of how good things are for each player, I guess we've got this map. This might be the... Yeah. This map's a new addition this year as well, and it's interesting. This is, I believe, the light table. Yes, no, it's not the light table. Let me just double check actually. Sorry guys, I'm going to load this back up. Oh, I don't know if this is table 8 or not. Have I got it? That was the light table, table 8, which actually is not super duper light. Obviously, you could have held that behind the objective there. Behind the ruin, sorry. But it's, you know, obviously pretty light. So that's table 8, table 7, and then we're on to, this is Tipping Point. Table 8, table 7, to double check, yes. And this is looking a little bit more like what I'm used to. Table 7, I mean, this map is crazy. Okay, this map is pretty wacky. You've got a giant line straight down the middle, but there are some kind of reversed Uno ruins here, which are going to be interesting to hold. This one's definitely like a bit more shooting friendly than the other maps, which on Tipping Point were kind of one or the other, I think, so to speak. Okay, so places where you can deploy. Obviously, you can deploy right here. This is a perfectly good spot. And scout moving in here is absolutely fantastic. Now, if your opponent is a little bit disrespectful, you can get a deployment down here, which is also nice to buy you a bit of space. You've obviously got this. And the Hammer and Anvil maps, you know, compared to other maps, are going to be a little bit more... There's obvious places where you can deploy, right? Maybe the macro strategy is a bit different. You can deploy here, but there is a key angle here. You want to cut just down this ruin right here. In fact, you kind of want to cut this one here, I would say. So this part, this angle right here, is really where you want to cut. And you could maybe even go a bit more aggressive and cut this angle right here. But basically, don't deploy right here in the corner, right? Where your opponent is going to be able to look down. But do deploy where you can like move here and then shoot so to prevent them from deploying in the open right here as well. Now, likewise, if you're here, then your ability to shoot onto this point is pretty easy, right? You can move here and shoot onto this point here, but Your natural expansion is actually this expansion objective right here, right? For example, you're going to want to put your like primary expansion holding objective units like right here, because this is actually the densest part of the board, right? It may not look like it, but you can hold this objective right here whilst also being within heroic range of a unit that's right here, for example. You can be right here and have your unit here, and you're within heroic range right there. Counterpoint though, your opponent, if they've got a small enough tank, can put the tank along the side here and get a really thin angle down here. You can see like a Rep-X doesn't really work that way. So if I've got that there, it still doesn't really work. So they're going to have to probably drive from the middle of the board and then come all the way across here into the middle and then try and get some kind of angle onto that. Or they're going to have deployed it here so they can put it on the terrain plate and shoot you. That is not impossible, so that's something to be aware of. They can move it here, pivot, and then shoot onto here if possible. But this is the objective you're trying to attack really, and you're trying to do so by having a unit staged here. Now, the problem being that is if you stage a unit here to attack, you are kind of very vulnerable to these angles down the board, right? So as a repulsor there, they're going to move down here. Shooting here is trivial, right? So you don't really want to stage a unit here that's like not that strong. You can try and tuck a unit across the back here, but once again, this is like very easy to get shot from down there or discharged and move back onto the objective. So to attack your opponent's expansion, you want to have your units primarily staged in this ruin right here. And you'll find that this is like very close, right? To the back of the objective is 15 inches. And there's zero repercussions for you right there. Strat reserving on this board with vehicles is decent, but I wouldn't say it's very fantastic, particularly because if your opponent has units staged on this objective, they can very much push them out where you can't have interacted with them before that, and they're going to push your strat reserves back here. And then strat reserving across here is very, very difficult, for example. On top of that, strat reserving on both Tipping Point and Hammer and Anvil is always more risky because it's very easy to screen the short board edge, as people would call it. Right, it's very easy to screen back here. It's very easy to screen back here with units that naturally want to stage into these ruins right here. Alright, that's the Hammer and Anvil map. Let's hopefully get on to some of the more classic ones I'm a bit more accustomed to. That was map 6. Eight, 7, 6. Here we go. Oh, this is from the original maps that they developed for 10th edition. And there's a few more interesting things going on in this map, I think. I'll get Mechanized Guard here. Okay, so essentially, I'm just going to cover this map because essentially the other map is basically the same. It's just that these ruins are more or less straight on, for example, right? Okay, so this map right here. A couple of interesting things going on, and one of them being hiding a big unit is actually a little bit harder than it seems. In fact, I'm going to just go over to the other map. You'll see. So that's one of the maps. I think that was map 5, I think. There is another map here, which is the other map which gets played, which is slightly different. It's just that the ruins are more front on. Oh, this map also gets played. Oh, I haven't talked about that one. We'll finish on that one, because that should get played for Search and Destroy, actually. Okay, so you can see that the only difference here is that these ruins are not, they're not angular, they're straight on. Okay, so a couple of things about this map. One, to hold your expansion objective, or to have your opponent hold it against you, they can do a couple of things. They can, for example, put a unit right here, which is actually quite hard to shoot. Okay? They can put an Ogryn unit here, or they might not be playing Ogryns, but they can put a unit here, and actually that unit's quite hard to shoot if you want to, unless you want to be on the terrain plate here, right? So you will have to trade. So it is a little bit more denser than it seems, despite this looking pretty open. Likewise, you can do the same. You could tuck a unit in here, and for them to actually get onto here is a little bit harder than it looks, because if they want to move onto this terrain plate and shoot you, well, they're going to have probably have been deployed in the open here. You know, for example, for me to move a Chimera from safety would be like here. This is 5, and then 8 is a 13-inch movement. Well, luckily on an exact 13-inch movement, the Chimera makes it, but mini tanks can't move 13 inches and shoot you, and it can go right there. And then obviously it can be traded, like this is pretty open, so it can be shot all the way down the board edge here. So that's kind of a thing about playing on this this one. Now there is a map where they are tilted towards an angle where the objective is more or less, if I go lock, it's kind of like this. It's like this. No, it's like this, yeah. Something like that, maybe. And you can hold it. I think it's maybe like something like that, maybe. You can hold it just behind here. That kind of illustrates the point, though. Obviously, just try and hold it behind there if you can. So, strat reserves on this map are a little bit better, especially for big vehicles, because you can strat reserve onto here and then move and naturally shoot and hold the objective, right? So that's primarily where you want to be in terms of that. Now this one here is good for Rogal Dawns as well, because you can move through this part here, strat reserve on here, move and then shoot onto that one as well. So one thing that this does get awkward is actually where you deploy can be a little bit strange on this board. There is kind of this deployment right here, but you can get shot if your opponent is going to deploy here. So I'd recommend if you've got a vehicle which is lower than the ruin wall of 4 inches here, you do want to kind of just put it front and center here, and it would actually be very hard to shoot. So you can actually get 2 of them if you're right here, and then you have one right here, and then that's quite hard to shoot down this line. I guess maybe not that line right there, so it'd have to come in. So probably one thing right here. So you do want to have a small piece that you can deploy right here. Then your shooting assets are kind of dwindling. If you've got a big one, you've kind of got to put it roughly here. This is going to be in the open, like this is available to shoot, and then the other place to deploy is going to be right here as well. So these 2 assets are okay to deploy. Otherwise, you're kind of looking at this angle right here, which is, it's not on the, you know, it's pretty safe, I would say, but it is very, very telegraphed, right? So you can deploy it on the line. Oh, and actually you cannot move a Dawn through this part right here. So if your tank's as wide as a Dawn, I think a Dawn is 5.09 or 5.1, you can't deploy it right there. So you're primarily going to be playing through these routes back here, and you're going to want to move, say your big tank, shooting tank is going to want to move like here, counter shoot, and it's kind of going to move here, maybe counter shoot something that's here, for example, and then eventually it's going to want to end up onto this piece right here, or on the middle, and then onto this piece, hopefully right here, and then shooting onto this terrain piece. So those are the 2 main areas. I think if you're playing a combat army, this can get a little bit dicey in some sense, because you're going to want to play, if you're playing a combat army, you obviously want to put your unit right here. So, for example, to deploy it, you are going to deploy it on the line here, and then maybe string it back a little bit, like you can deploy here. Maybe this guy off the terrain piece. You know, this angle's not that easy to shoot unless your opponent is YOLOing something, deploying here, moving and shooting you. And you're just going to want to jam that right in the middle to begin with, of course, to give you enough mid-board presence. Then you're going to want to stage, like, if you can, stage opposite it, like here. This angle's not super hard to shoot, so just be aware of that. You can put one, oh, I'll do the other ruin here. You could put one against the terrain here, and then like 3 on the terrain, 2 off the terrain, and that's a little bit harder to shoot. Once again, it's kind of like there. So your opponent, if they're decent, can move here preemptively and shoot there. Otherwise, you're just going to want to put them inside your home ruin, and the charge distance is not super long here. Like you're talking a 9, a 3 up, you're well on the objective, so you can basically charge anything. So make sure you've got your trading pieces ready on your home ruin. Turn 1, deploy them in here. Turn 2, just move a bit forward, and then you're into there. Your melee units into here, for example, and you're going to try and hold this objective as well. But you can kind of see that, I guess for a melee army here, I didn't know that was unlocked. This unit right here, you've got a reasonably long charge to get onto here if your opponent is holding it right at the back and you only have melee and you don't have guns, right? Another thing is they can hold it like back here as well if you don't have any guns, but also if you don't have any guns that can reach this angle and then shoot onto it, right? Like that can be slightly problematic if they hold it sort of like this right here, and then like this, and then like this. Like you've got this line here that you have to reach to shoot it. So if you haven't deployed something here to shoot or here to shoot that can reach that, they can get a cheeky angle to hide there on turn 1. Otherwise, you're primarily just moving here and then shooting there. These kind of hammer and anvil boards, they don't really have a natural expansion, so to speak, that's very obvious for each player. So you're not so much when you're playing hammer and anvil and hammer and anvil trying to control a center of the board and then push that to an advantage. You're trying to have a good, clean macro strategy trading that you can leverage over 5 turns, so that hopefully you can hold the objectives later on without an opponent being able to get there. Primarily because moving on to here and then shooting is decent. Moving over here to shooting or staying here, moving on there to shoot is decent, or staging a melee unit here and just shooting there is quite easy as well. Okay guys, I think that's like all of either all of them or the majority of the maps covered. I think this is like a couple hours long at least. Hopefully this helped. If you just want to load up a particular map and have my thoughts on it, welcome. And if you've just stayed to the end and maybe you're doing some painting or something, thank you very much for listening. I've been David Gaylord. Check out 40kfireside.com and have a good one. See you later.